Because our daughter took a semester abroad at the University of Edinburgh. And at the end of it, my wife and I took our sons to Scotland, and we drove around for 2 weeks all over Scotland. And I found all kinds of really interesting things. And one of the interesting things I found was these are walking stick badges. They're ubiquitous all over Scotland and the UK, and I thought they were really cool. And I thought, well, I'll buy the badges and then I'll buy a stick. And when I went to the place that had the sticks, they were like $150 to $200. And I thought, yeah, I think I could make the stick part, but I couldn't make this part. But luckily I found a place that sold the antlers already pre-drilled. And so I bought the antler, I made the stick, and Bob's your uncle. So I got this nice stick, and I thought, this is kind of a cool thing. Let me look into this a little bit more. So this is what they do in Scotland. These are sticks that have horns that are boiled and bent and then carved. And this is really high art. These guys are incredible. So I found a couple of books on walking sticks and stick making, and I read them through and through and through, and they were pretty interesting, and I came up with a couple of interesting designs that were based on the Scottish. So this is a natural thumbstick. This is just a stick that has a V in it, and I put a couple little ebony pins on the top of it. So I started experimenting. So this is one, I had a nice piece of rosewood, and I found something in a book that was kind of similar to this, so I made another thumbstick. And so the thumbstick idea is that if you're walking, it feels good on your thumb. You can walk with it. It's easy to carry. And if they're taller, they use them as spotting scopes. You stick them in the ground. You use them as a spotting scope. You can use them to rest your gun if you're hunting. So it's functional, but it's an interesting piece. My daughter was so enamored with Scotland that she went back a year after she graduated and worked there for about 6 months. And I gave her the name of a place that sold some antler parts. This happens to be water buffalo, black water buffalo, and it came pretty much like that. I just had to sand it and put it on the stick. Unfortunately, the U.S. government has stopped the importation of any of this stuff. So you can't get it there. You have to find somebody who has access to this stuff in the States. So this is a Banksia pod. I don't know if you've ever played with these things, but it's about this big, and it comes from Australia. It's a seed pod. And inside of this thing, there are the seeds, which have already fallen out when you get it. It's very, very hard. And you start turning it, and you think you're going to get down to this part, and you get through the initial layer, and then there's this red fuzz that you have to turn through, and it is just all over you and all over everything. It's the weirdest thing I ever saw. So I tried making something that was a little bit off kilter, and so I glued this thing up, and then I turned it and cut the blank out so that I got this angled piece. And I thought that was kind of interesting, and it gave me the idea that maybe I should think about selling some of these things and turning some of them. Came up with the idea of laminating these with different layers and different colors and turning them. And so I've probably made about 40 sticks over time. So I started making these, and I know this is a turning presentation, but I'm going to spend a little time on the stick part, because the turning part pretty straightforward, but the stick part is kind of interesting, and it has a bunch of different pieces to it. Let me talk about the sticks. So I usually make a bunch of sticks at a time, because setting up all this stuff, as you'll hear, takes a lot of time, and there's no point in making one at a time. You might as well make a bunch of them. So first of all, it's not that easy finding sticks. because most of the land that has trees growing on it is owned by somebody. And my very first and most important rule of stick finding is don't get arrested. I found that there are rail trails. These are used to be railroad right-of-ways, and they've turned them into walking and hiking paths. You really want to harvest the sticks in the winter, because in the winter, the sap is rising in the tree. And what that does is it helps keep the bark on the stick. The other thing about the winter time is, first of all, it's a lot easier to spot the sticks, because if you go in the summertime, there's all this vegetation. You can't even see what you're looking at. So I like going in the wintertime. Also, there's less people out there walking around. So if I see a really nice stick, there's nobody watching me cutting it. So the trick is to find small saplings. Obviously, the straighter the better, but I'll talk to you about how to straighten them. Oftentimes, if they cut a tree down, often there are new trees that sprout from the edges of them. In the UK, it's called copsing. And these, what's really great about these is that when they cut the tree down, there's now a huge amount of sunlight coming in. And so these things grow absolutely straight up. So typically, I'm looking for something that's roughly 1.25 to 1.5 in diameter. That's what I want to finish it at. I want this to be about 1.25, maybe an inch if it's a skinnier stick. If you're doing it for somebody and they have big hands, 1.5. But usually, 1.125, 1.25 is about right. So I try to find stuff that's about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. But you also don't want to cut it too short because they're going to crack. The ends are going to crack, and so you want to leave enough room for that to happen and for you to trim these later. So I cut the branches. I leave about a 3/4 inch stub on, because I found if I cut it too close, it cracks into the stick. If I leave it long, everything dries fine, and basically it's the usual rule of thumb, a year per inch of thickness. So my favorite sticks are these, are where the vine has grown up around the sapling. And where it does that, it deforms the wood underneath it. And so you can find these, and they're really cool. But I'm a technical guy, so I wanted to know, well, what do you call that? That must have a really, like a botanical name. And so I looked everywhere, and I finally discovered that the correct name for this is twisty stick. So I try to find twisty sticks. They're not that easy to find, but they're really kind of interesting. The one thing about them is that if you find one and there's a vine growing on it, you want to take the vine out when it's green, because if you let it sit in there, it's just going to be hard as a rock, and it's going to be almost impossible to get it out. So if I find one, I immediately take it home and take that vine out, and then I dry it for a year. But sometimes they're too big, and so this is what I came up with. So I've made a couple of these benches, and what's absolutely fascinating is on the really good twisty sticks, that angle that vine has grown up on is exactly even all the way up the stick. One of the things that you have to do is straighten the stick. They're usually not perfectly straight, but they're usually straightenable. So after a few unsuccessful attempts at trying to straighten these sticks using some crazy ideas that people had, I decided to build a steam box. And since the sticks are pretty small, I didn't really need a big box. And so I opted for this round PVC version. This is 6-inch diameter, 4 feet long. It's called Schedule 40 PVC pipe, and you can put steam in it, nothing bad's going to happen to it. So the bottom end is closed with a cap, and it has a hole for the steam hose. And it also has another hole where the water can drip out. If you'll notice, it's at an angle on that frame, so that when the steam goes in there and it gets caught, it runs down into that hole and drips into a little can at the bottom. There are several wood dowels that are drilled into the sides that support the sticks. You don't want them sitting in the bottom getting wet. You just want them steamed. Being both cheap and resourceful, I repurposed my mother's pressure cooker. I took the vent off and stuck a radiator hose on it, and I put it on a hot plate, and that's how I generate the steam. So my mom would be proud, because if you straighten it when it's green and then you put it up to dry, it's going to move. So you want it to move and stabilize and then straighten it. So this is my stick straightening fixture, something similar that I saw online. And the spaces in between the blocks are quarter-inch increments. So depending on how big the stick is, I put it in here and I bend it, and if it's too big, I put it in the next. I got a whole bunch of places I can put different size sticks to bend them. The rule of thumb for a walking stick, this is not set in stone, is armpit height. You want it to be at your armpit, because when you put your hand 90 degrees to your body, so when you're, I'll come out here, so when you do this, you want to be holding it below the topper. And you want the topper long, because when you're going uphill, it's fine. When you're going downhill, a lot of times you put your hand on this to steady yourself. So generally, that's what you want. Some people like them bigger, some people like them smaller, but rule of thumb is roughly here. I'm going to put the sticks in the steamer. And so at this point, I cut them down a bit to get them to be, maybe if I cut them at 60 inches, I cut them down to about 55 inches or 50 inches for a medium-sized stick. And I try to find the end that's close to that 1 to 1 1/4 inch diameter, because I only got a 4-foot thing here to stick these in. And sometimes, depending on where I have to bend them, I'll put them in this way, straighten that part, turn them around, put them in the other way. So at this point, I cut the stubs a little bit more. If there are branches sticking out, I cut them a little bit more so they don't get tangled up. And I generally try to look over the sticks and get an idea of where those bends are on each. I only do 3 sticks at a time to try to figure out where I'm going to bend it, because once you take this out of the steamer, you got to get over to that thing and really start doing it, because I'm not steaming them so much that they're so porous that they're gonna wait forever. So how long to steam them? I start out about 20 minutes at a time, and then I take a stick out and I try it. And some of them are more porous, and that will work. Some of them got to go back a couple times. It's real trial and error. I put a towel over the end of this thing, over the open end, so I can keep taking them out. Put the towel on so the steam doesn't escape. And I use leather gloves, because these things are hot. So when you bend them, you can usually tell, if you hold them, you can usually tell if they're springing back. Most of the time they don't. Again, if you get them just the right porousness and straighten them and just hold them for about 30 seconds, you take it out and you can see if it's springing back or not. Okay, so I let the sticks, at this point I let them dry overnight before I do anything else. And the next step is to actually figure out what size stick am I making. A lot of it has to do with how tapered the small end is, because if it gets too small, it's really no good. So I start at the top and I try to cut it that inch and an eighth, 1 1/4 at the top. I put a piece of masking tape around them. I take them on the bandsaw. I cut them as straight as I can, and then a little bit of sanding, and I'm done. And then I go to the other end. I often leave the bottom end longer than I need, because I can always trim that. I'm really working off the top. The stick is not perfectly round at that top. But the piece that's going to go on it, that I'm going to turn on the lathe, because this is about wood turning, is always perfectly round. So the trick here is to measure that top of the stick and measure the widest point. So you're going to turn a piece that's going to be the size, maybe a little bit oversized, of the widest point of the stick, because you can always shave the other parts down. Okay. I start with a perfectly square piece, jointed, planed. That center piece is perfectly square. And so, but I have this little spacer. And so what I typically do is I find some of the woods that I used in the topper, and I just make a sandwich. I glue up, I take a solid piece like this, and I glue a couple of pieces of veneer onto it, and I drill a 3/8 inch hole in the middle of it. And then what I do is I take the stick and I put the stick in a vise, and with my best eagle eye, I take a 3/8 inch bit in my drill and I drill straight into it, and about 2.5 inches deep, because what I'm gonna do eventually is I'm gonna take this 3/8 inch rod, I'm gonna put it in that hole, I'm gonna put the spacer on it, and then I'm gonna put this on, and I'm gonna epoxy them all together. That's basically what the idea is. Now, so I typically take this and I put it on here. I put the spacer on here. And so again, this is not really round. So I got to try to, and I don't want to spend my life taking this down. So what I do is I put a mark on the masking tape. Just put a mark on the masking tape. And then I lay this on there, and I take a pencil and I draw the bottom of it. I draw the outline, and I mark that mark. So when I cut it out close to that, I know where my alignment is, and I'm not putting the small end on the wrong side. So I do that, and then I try to take it down as close as I can to this piece, I try to leave about roughly maybe 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit less on here. The center point of all these sticks is typically the pith. There's that thing running through here, and it's usually right pretty much in the center. So I use that as my center point. I don't try to figure out where it is. I just drill on that center, that line. And I also take that drill and I move it in and out. I want just a little bit of play, because it's really, I don't know, I'm not doing this on a table saw. I don't know if this is really straight 90 degrees. There's always a little bit of slop. So I want to be able to do this and get this, if I have to pull it in one direction or another, to get it to be perfectly flat when I epoxy it on there. Let's see. So I wrap this blue tape around so that the epoxy doesn't go down on the bark, and I glue this all together with epoxy. When the epoxy's dry, I try to chip off as much stuff as I can, and this is the finesse part. So the finesse part is to try to take this piece down so that it's exactly the size of the stick, so that it's perfectly matched to the stick without damaging the bark. So at a certain point, the tape is giving me a little bit of fudge room, but the tricky part is at some point you got to take the tape off and really massage it very carefully, and you'll see most of the sticks are pretty well done. So that this is just in my head. This is not anything that comes in a book. This is just, I want it to look like that. So what I've got here is I've got a Fordham flexible shaft machine. And I've got a bunch of burrs, and I lay the thing down on there, and this is a weird setup. So those blue things are actually 10-pound ankle weights. they turned out to be really wonderful because they're really heavy. They leave the thing up off the bench. They have kind of a V in them where the pieces go together. And those other pieces I had 5-pound ankle weights that started disintegrating. And so I took all the little metal pieces and I found these are sandbags from Home Depot. And so I poured them in there and wrapped them up small. And so what I do is I lay that stick out on there and I put those on, and it allows me to turn the stick and keep working on it without clamping it or moving it. I put those things on there. This thing is not going anywhere. It's just I don't expect you all to do this, but it works for me. And so I very carefully bring everything down there and sand it and do all that stuff. So this is what it looks like. Just a nice little detail. And let's see. But the last step is to do this. So this is a brass ferrule that has a black oxide finish. And and I happened to find these at a supply place online. And they come in a whole bunch. You can see there's a whole bunch of sizes here. And so the last step, if I know that I'm selling it, it's mine, or I'm selling it to somebody and I know the exact height that they need, I just start with a rasp and I start tapering the bottom of it. And the really great thing about it is before I sand the inside to get the oxide off so that I can epoxy it, I take it and I rub it around there. And what's great is the oxide hits all the high spots. And so I keep doing that until there are no high spots and it fits perfectly to the bottom. So my go-to finish for almost everything these days is General Finish is Armor Seal. So I think that's probably it. Now, once you make all these sticks, the next thing is you got to make a stick stand. So that's what I did, and those are a bunch of my sticks. And thank you for your attention. I hope you found it interesting. And thanks.